Hey, let's talk about backspin. Backspin, underspin, chop, goes by a few different names, but backspin, opposite of topspin. I think for anybody that watching this video, you're very well aware of it. But there's some things that don't usually get talked about dealing with underspin. And there are players who base their entire game, mostly intermediate level players, on pushes, trying to get you to put the ball in the net, just not be able to make a standard push as well as they do. Most of those players aren't going to advance much further than the intermediate levels, but they can still cause problems for players up to that level. So something about the push, it doesn't get talked about much, and we're talking about a little underspin chop over the table. Unless you're extremely advanced player and you really know how to handle this, then you're probably still going to have to do some pushes. And there's more than one way to deal with underspin, and I'm going to try to hit on all of them. First one, if you happen to be playing with long pips, underspin is your friend. You can bump it back. Not that it's going to be incredibly easy, but if you're comfortable with long pips on your backhand, then what's going to happen is you can bump that back and it'll go back as light topspin most of the time. So that's one thing. But if you're not playing with pips, then you got some other things to deal with. If somebody gives you heavy underspin, until you really learn how to turn that ball back over into topspin, you're still going to have to do some pushes. And I know players up to 2,000 level that still have to use pushes at times, and they prefer to get into a topspin game, but at that level they've learned how to push well, and more importantly know when to push. So when we're talking about that push, whether it's forehand or backhand, it's where you're making contact on the bottom part of the ball. Depending on your racket, your style, there's a few little variables, but basically if it's heavy underspin and the person that does the chop, the push, the serve, if they get all the way, say, to the south pole of the ball, when you do your push, you're going to have to get just as far underneath as they did, or else you're going to end up putting the ball in the net or even straight onto the table. And in the ITTF coaching course I had, I learned a little different terminology for this, and they said that you could make shots with either a what was it they said? Oh yes, gumming or peeling, and I thought those were weird. I never heard them anywhere else. Gumming would be when you just go straight in, maybe a 45-degree angle, the ball sinks into the sponge, and that's the way most people learn how to push. But for heavy spin, that's not going to be enough. You're going to have to actually wrap. You can kind of see how that goes. Get under the ball all the way to the south pole and really get to the front of the ball. And we're talking about a smooth rubber here, but it could be true with short pips as well. Only thing with long pips, it's a different deal. But that's something that if you're aware of it, you can make your pushes. If you can get all the way to the front of the ball and you know that your opponent can't, you're going to get a lot of points by them putting the ball into the net. And I said, intermediate to advanced players usually know how to handle those well enough. And when I'm coaching about serves, I usually don't recommend going with straight topspin or straight underspin, but trying to add side spin. But for certain shots, if you're really trying to put heavy underspin on your serve or on a push, you want to have that peeling. That's the peeling or wrapping underneath the ball. Good racket speed will help with that. And a good way to practice this is find somebody and play a match where all you can use is underspin. You don't want to overdo this, but it'll quickly tell you how well you're handling underspin. If you play somebody who does well with underspin and they beat you 11-2, you probably need a lot of work on those underspin shots. Now, there are other options, and they're more advanced, but there's the lifting the ball up into topspin. Now, I'm not going to get into all the technical aspects of how to do that. There are a lot of videos about that. What I will say is that you have to know when to do it. If the ball is a little higher, a little less underspin, those are the ones you probably can start off flipping over into topspin. And what's happening is the ball is rotating with underspin towards you, and if you take the ball and flip it back over into topspin, the spin is continuing and goes back as topspin. But again, you got to know when to do it. You don't necessarily want to do it on the heaviest chop against the players that give you the heaviest spin. You want to maybe have to push a couple. A lot of intermediate players would go up a level if they knew when to push and when to open instead of making that mistake. A lot of times they're trying to open on everything. Sometimes they're trying to push on everything. It's knowing when to do which makes a huge difference in the level of your game. Other way to deal with underspin that is rarely talked about is if you have short serves, short underspin, even short side spin, top spin, there's a possibility of bumping the ball over. Even with inverted rubber, you don't necessarily have to push it. You don't have to turn it over into topspin, but you'll see top players do this frequently, where they take the ball and bump it short or bump it to a certain spot, and sometimes that's exactly the right shot you want to do. It's the ball that keeps you in the point for one more shot than you otherwise would have. If you force a flip or end up pushing right into a power loop from your opponent, that's not going to work so well either. One of the things I want to emphasize, in my last video I talked about a key to consistency, and that was about getting the ball at the top of the bounce. And that's not the only key to consistency. It just happens to be the first thing that I usually notice with new players, and if they don't learn that about getting forehand and backhand drop is at a consistent spot, usually at the top of the bounce, they're usually going to struggle, and I find some intermediate players are struggling with that as well because they never learned how to do it. So sometimes you have a player who comes in who does some things really, really well, but then on other things, basic things they should have learned probably in their first couple lessons, they don't do so well. So there's more than one key to consistency, and learning how to deal with underspin is one of them. At the very beginning levels, when players are really beginners are only comfortable with light top spin, no spin kind of shots, learning how to do underspin gets you past all those players. Now, I'm sure that most people watching this video are long past that, but you still may not be dealing with underspin as well as you can, and it's a big part of it because most players endlessly practice their top spin counter loops, but don't spend near as much time dealing with underspin, and then what happens, you go into a match and the very first serve is underspin. So you want to watch out for that, try to learn how to handle that and figure out what works best for you. I would say as your game improves, you should have, I'm figuring if you're an all-around looping, attacking player, and even if you're a defensive player, there are should be an advancement to where you're doing less and less pushes yourself, unless you're a really purely defensive player. I found that I do better in matches if I open before my opponent, and there have been coaches who have said that that's the standard, that the person that opens into topspin usually has the advantage, is more likely to win the point. But that's great. That's great advice. You need to learn how to do that. But in the meantime, you still need to learn all the ways you may have to deal with underspin. If you can't reserve heavy underspin serves because you're not getting under the ball enough, you'll still have problems. All right, appreciate your feedback, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.